Oh my God, is it really that time already? Well, I guess it is. So let's push on and let's push on with our investigation of American politics. Welcome to American politics. You're going to love this. I absolutely adore it. As long as you get your head around the very, very simple concept, two simple concepts. First of all, that this is all a system of games and rules. The games and the rules will change from time to time, but if you get into the mentality of thinking, okay, there's a specific set of rules that are going to apply here, there's a specific game we're playing here, and then that game will change from time to time to time, then you'll get your head around American politics. That's fantastic. The second problem, or the second thing you've got to think about, is that America is writ large a living manifestation of the law of unexpected consequences. No matter what they tried to do, they wound up cooking up and it sort of spun out in a slightly different direction. But it's a wonderful system. I adore it. I'm sure you'll adore it. And we'll have a lot of fun. But let's start. And we start with the Constitution. And here we are. It's the Constitution. And in order to make progress here, let's just take a step back. Let's step back and think about what a constitution is. Well, a constitution is two things. First of all, it's a structural thing. It's a blueprint for government. It lays out the organization of the offices of the state and the distribution of the power throughout those offices. And no, it doesn't really matter what color it is, as long as it is that blueprint. It's a structural document, an engineering document. This is what the state is going to look like. This is what the various offices of the state are going to do. There's another sense in which it works, and that is the principle, or rather the contract. There's that contract between the citizens and the state. This is what the governors will expect of the governed, and this is what the citizens can expect of their government. So this thing works in two different senses, the blueprint and the contract. If you remember that, you should remember that from your AS anyway, then you're going to be in pretty good shape. Now, the other thing we need to think about is starting points. Now, when we're looking at the presidency or the judiciary or indeed Congress, we always start with the Constitution. What does the Constitution tell us about those things? So if our starting point for everything else is the Constitution, then where is our starting point? Where is our fixed point for a question on the Constitution itself? Okay, well, we go backwards. This is the Declaration of Independence. You remember this. I talk about it a lot as being one of the finest examples of American writing ever. So now again, we need to go back. Let's think a little bit about the British Constitution. And you should remember from last year that the British Constitution is a combination of two things. It's a combination of abstract principles that have emerged from the mists of time, those principles being the rule of law, parliamentary sovereignty, constitutional monarchy, that sort of stuff. Parliamentary government, that's what I meant to say. And those are given shape, form and structure by the sources of the Constitution, statute law, common law, constitutional conventions, and so on and so forth. Now, we have the same thing at work in the United States. We've got general principles which arise from the Declaration of Independence. This is why the Americans decided to create, or why the founding fathers decided to create a new government, a new country under a new set of rules. And we find those principles written in the Declaration of Independence. Well, not so much written in the Declaration of Independence as kind of hidden in the Declaration of Independence. And these two sentences you will have heard me use before. These are the distillation, the raw essence of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And we can see here a number of things. First of all, we've got this idea of rights. We need to know about the idea of rights. We need also to know about the idea of limited government. What is government's job? Government's job is simply to secure those rights. It's not about leading the people in the right direction. It's about securing rights. Limited government. And then the third thing that we get from here is that they are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, which is essentially a definition of democracy. So the key principles that emerge from the Declaration of Independence are universal, unalienable rights, along with that, the primacy of the individual. We have that idea of limited or contained government, and we have democracy. And the extent to which the Constitution works is the extent to which it manages to give shape and structure, or to reify those particular principles. So just like the British Constitution, we've got an abstract set of principles that Dicey argued emerged from the mists of time. So we can look at the Declaration of Independence, identify certain key principles, and then hold those principles against the Constitution to see whether or not the Constitution works. Now, doing that is going to be a long, long job. Democracy, we've got elections, but there's lots of them. It's a bit messy. Limited government, well, we've got these things. We've got separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and rights. That also limits government while also establishing the primacy of the individual. And those are constitutional rights, enumerated rights, and rights identified by the judiciary. Now, these are very, very complicated concepts. And we will only be able to make full sense of them once we have gone through the particular branches of government, once we've gone through the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Once we've been through all of those, we'll be able to go back and look at these ideas in much more detail. But what we're going to look at right now is just the general structure of those things. How do those things work in practice? What does the Constitution tell us about the structures that are designed to represent or to serve as vehicles for those principles? So democracy, that's all about Unit 3. I'm going to delegate that to Mr. Barker, and once he's been through all of the elections with you, we will come back at them and look and see how those relate to the general principle of democracy as understood or as sort of intended by the Constitution. We, however, have to look now at limited government and the way in which the separation of powers works, the way in which checks and balances works, and the way in which federalism works. Again, we're going to come back and look at all of these in much more detail, or rather it will make much more sense once we've looked at the actual institutions themselves. But for the time being, we can look at an overview of the structures and the general ideas behind these particular concepts. We'll also have a quick look at the primacy of the individual as described by rights. And we're going to do this at a tremendous rate. We're going to do this at a tremendous rate just in this presentation. There's a lot of stuff to get through. But the general idea is, how do we contain that power? Now, remember the context here. Remember the birth of the United States. They were fleeing, or certainly according to the national mythology, they were fleeing an overarching executive. And what they really wanted to ensure was that that situation would never be able to represent itself in the United States. So we have our executive, legislative, and judiciary. We have our institutions of state, but that is contained by these four specific ideas: by the separation of powers, by federalism, checks and balances, and by rights. Now again, we're going to go through this at a rate of knots. You have the recording, you can pause, you can rewind, you can do all of those things. I've only got 15 minutes and I'm already 7.5 of them through, so I should probably get a bit of a shift on. Now, this is the actual Constitution itself. Remember, this is not a pub quiz. They're not going to ask you what happened in Article 7 or what happens in Article 2, but if you can say the President's powers are laid out in Article 2 and they include this, that, and the other, then that is a good thing. Amendments, 27, or is it? Well, you've already seen my parlor game about how we start with 27, we subtract 10, we subtract another 2, and we get to 15. Again, these are just little things, not a pub quiz, but the more familiar you are with the general layout of the Constitution, the stronger you're going to be when you go into that exam. So, as I said earlier, it is a blueprint for government. They talk about achieving a more perfect union, and we do that by balancing effective government with limited government, democratic principles with protection from the problems democracy creates, and the rights of the states within the context of the needs of the nation. Again, all of this is something that we're going to look into in more detail as we go through the course. Right now, we're just taking a general overview of the Constitution, and we are doing it at a tremendous rate. So here we are again, we're just balancing these things, balancing effective government with responsible government, separation of powers, checks and balances, and what we find generally is that it doesn't work. Okay, there's a spoiler alert, everything about the United States is fundamentally broken. But that's the fun bit, and explaining how that works in principle is just one of the best bits about teaching politics. So let's start off with the declaration. We'll look at the separation of powers. Now, I've mentioned this idea about the accumulation of powers in the same hands being justly pronounced the very definition of tyranny. That, of course, was Madison, tail end of the 18th century. No one's bettered it, so remember it. Now, this was Montesquieu. Montesquieu identified our three corners of the legal triangle. Now, but this is just really the broad overview. This does not describe how the separation of powers works. This describes how the separation of powers works. First of all, we differentiate our power. We have our legislation, we have our executive, we have our judiciary. That takes us back to the slide from Montesquieu. But really, what happens next is the key thing. We have this doctrine of incompatibility. If you're in one branch, you can't be a member of another branch. Now, we know this because Obama was a senator. He had to relinquish that position in order to become president. That doesn't happen in the UK. In fact, it's the very opposite in the UK. You cannot be a member of the executive, you cannot be a member of government unless you're a member of parliament. That's one team of the principle of parliamentary government. Doesn't apply in the United States. We have incompatibility, cannot be a member of more than one branch. Obviously, in the UK, we do have a sense of incompatibility in that you can't be in the judiciary and another branch after we cleared out the Lord Chancellor. That was cleared, sorted out. But we still have that overlap or fusion of the executive and the legislative. So in the United States, you simply can't be a member of more than one branch. Simples. This is not so simple. This was put to me in a tutorial by Geoffrey Marshall, who I had at university, tremendous student, not in 71, that's just when he wrote this. And I remember him saying to me, delegata potestas non potestat delegari. If you have been given the function of legislation, you can't then hand that on to the executive. You can't then hand that on to somebody else. The legislature cannot say to the executive, oh, I really can't be bothered doing my job. You do it for me. Similarly, the executive cannot ask the legislature to execute legislation. Doesn't happen. So everything is fixed. You can't play musical chairs, and you can't shuffle your powers. Those are the ways in which the separation of power is upheld. And then in addition to that, we've got formal checks on the other branches. This is the principle of checks and balances. Now, I'm going to go through these very, very quickly. You just have to learn them, and I can answer them questions as they come through. So you can stop and pause and digest. Questions you've got, please do send them through. Now, all of those things we're going to look at in much more detail. For now, let's just have a look at the idea of checks and balances. As it says there, again, this is Madison. What does it say? Ambition being used to balance the ambition of others. I kind of mangled that. That's what I meant to say. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So, again, you can slow this down and watch it in more detail. But again, all the way through here, what we've got is one branch watching the other branch. And it's summarized in this particular slide here. That's really it for the Constitution. I don't want to go on about it too much there, but I will answer your questions as and when they come up. Am I going to get through federalism in one slide? Well, only if you've done the Storyfies. If you don't follow this, go and look at the Storyfies again. You've got a Storyfy introduction 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that tells you all about federalism, the way in which it both divides and limits power while shaping the relationship between the governors and the governed. It's all about ensuring a good mix, if you will. And you should remember that from the Constitution, we've got certain powers that are given to the federal government, we've got certain powers that are shared between the federal government and the state governments, and then everything else accrues to the states. And then on top of that, we've got the Supremacy Clause, the Elastic Clause, and the Interstate Commerce Clause. This is how federalism is manifest in the Constitution. End of. We will come back and look at that again later. When it comes to rights, again, this is all about the relationship between the governors and the governed. We've got enumerated rights, 1 to 10, 13, 14, and 15. We've then got inferred rights. These are rights not written in the Constitution, but recognized by the judiciary. And then we've got extended rights, which is what the judge described as an evolving standard of decency. Again, in both of these instances, these are not in the Constitution, but yet they are still held to apply. Now, that is a huge amount of information to process in one particular presentation. I'm sure you've got lots and lots of questions, and I really look forward to fielding those as soon as we get together again. See you then. Bye for now.